Thank you all for coming. It's really great to see everyone. Welcome to the Kepler lectures. We've had one. This is our second one. They're very special lectures from special people, and I'll let Clint take over and tell you a little more about what we're going to hear about today. It includes dinosaurs, so that's exciting for everyone. We're going to have a few more of these. We're going to talk about Venus. Mark your calendars on April 4th. We are going to have, that's Laurent Matesi. We are going to have Brigitte Knappmeyer-Endrun talk to us about Mars on April 25th. We're going to have Carol Cleland talk to us about extraterrestrial life, the search for extraterrestrial life on May 30th. And we hope to see you all at those. I'm going to turn it over to Clint, who's going to talk more specifically about Mark Richards, who we're really happy to have here today.
Okay, thank you. And I'm very happy to introduce Mark Richards. Mark is known for many things. He was a undergrad at University of Texas and then a PhD at Caltech. And he was a professor at University of Oregon and University of California at Berkeley, and that's where actually I know him from his time as a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. I was an undergrad, and it was the first geoscience class I ever took. I was about 18 years old, and after that class, I guess I was inspired, and it led me to where I am today. So. I also worked in Mark's lab. We had a big tank of corn syrup that was, I don't know, about that big and heated from below and making these plumes that came up. And we were studying those. And so it was a formative time for me. And so I'm very glad to introduce Mark today. And he's going to be talking about, well, he's known for I guess for uncovering some of the processes that make for some of the biggest volcanic events in Earth's history, and certainly some of the things we were studying in the corn syrup tank are related to that. And he's going to be, well, I'll let him describe any other things that are related to it. So thank you, and here's Mark.
Thank you. So is my microphone on? That's excellent. I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Clint, for hosting me. Thank you, Trina, for making my stay here so far easy. It's really a great pleasure to be here at this great institution and have an opportunity to talk about something fun. And I'm going to start off by disappointing you at the beginning. I am not an expert on dinosaurs, but I am going to talk about events surrounding their demise. For those of you who are not familiar with this, our friend T-Rex disappeared at this time at about 65 million years ago. It was one of the largest mass extinctions in recent Earth history. About 70% of species in marine terrestrial realms disappeared, killed the non-avian dinosaurs. For those of you who don't know, birds are dinosaurs, so they made it through. And it was only about 66 million years ago, which is a wink of an eye in Earth history. And, fortunately for us, it heralded the advent, let me see if I can find my cursor, of the rise of large mammals. Mammals were around before, crawling around under rocks, hiding from dinosaurs, but when the dinosaurs went away, they were on the ascent. And of course, that meant that primates, like us, were able to become ascendant, and that was good news for at least some of us. I'm going to start kind of the beginning of this story from my standpoint comes from literally this hand sample of rock from Gubbio, Italy, that a young Walter Alvarez brought to his father at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in 1977. This rock captures the boundary clay. What then was called the KT boundary. We now call it the KPG boundary, but it doesn't matter. With Cretaceous below and the Tertiary above, larger forams of a certain variety in the Cretaceous, smaller ones of different varieties, very distinct, very clear boundary in the marine sedimological record. And Walter had a simple question, which is how much time does this boundary clay represent? How long did this mass extinction take? And Luis's idea was to look at cosmic dust and fall as evidenced from platinum group elements. And you probably all know that the big discovery was this giant spike in iridium that could not be explained by known processes other than potential meteor impact. And this gave rise to a theory that we refer to as the Alvarez-Schmidt hypothesis, because Jan Schmidt in Holland and in Netherlands came up with the same thing at about the same time. And of course, this is the stuff in all of your kids' cartoon books about the demise of dinosaurs as giant asteroids landing and so forth. And it wasn't until that was published in 1980, and it wasn't until 1991 that a fellow named Alan Hildebrand rediscovered what Pemex geologists in Mexico had known since the 60s, which is there's a large impact crater structure here on the north side of the Chicxulub Peninsula. And here's Walter Alvarez and Jan Schmidt together at Mimbral on the coast of Mexico, looking at a section of surge deposits in the Gulf of Mexico from that impact. And I want to state at the outset, and I'll get back to you, part of my story is that even though the KPG boundary events are extremely controversial and acrimonious sometimes in geology among those of you who know about this, Jan and Walter have been best friends since co-discovering this. And I think that's a lesson for all of us. It could have worked out otherwise. Walter published a book called T-Rex and the Crater of Doom, which was a New York Times bestseller. It's a superbly written story of this discovery. The title was taken from the movie Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, in case you're wondering. And both are kind of clear adventure stories of different types, of course. Now, if I flash forward to 2013, Paul Rennie, the director of the Berkeley Geochronology Center, showed definitively, and it wasn't really in much doubt, but in 2013 he showed that the age of the Chicxulub impact from impact debris around the Caribbean was 66.038 plus or minus 0.025 million years. Astonishing precision of argon-argon dating. And almost within precision, the same age coming from what's called the iridium Z coal layer in the Hell Creek Formation of Montana and North and South Dakota, which is the most prolific dinosaur fossil-bearing formation on the planet. And we will get back to both Indiana Jones and to Hell Creek Formation at the end of this talk. But one could have considered this kind of definitive and say, okay, the KPG boundary as defined by the microfossil record and the impact are exactly the same age. And nobody doubts that. Well, most people don't doubt that at this time. You might say, okay, is that the end of the story? Why am I giving this talk? Don't we know what happened to the dinosaurs? Well, there's this problem. And many of you may know about this, but it stands in my mind still as the strangest geological paradox I know of. At exactly the same time, geologically speaking, we were erupting the largest basalt formations in the last 100 million years of Earth history, called the Deccan Traps lavas in India. This is a photo of the enormous Western Ghats section between Mumbai and Pune, if you've ever been there. And so this leads to a bit of a quandary. We have two causes of mass extinction potentially and one mass extinction. I'll get to that a little bit more later. Now, I'm going to show you two slides, which is the only two slides in this entire presentation where I'm actually an expert. And Clint hinted at this. I published a paper in 1989 with Bob Duncan and Vincent Courtillot suggesting that these very large igneous events, like the Deccan Traps here, are the expression of the initial expression of mantle plumes, hot, buoyant material rising from deep in the mantle, coming to the surface and causing enormous volcanic eruptions. And in this case, that plume stayed active and is presently active down here at the Reunion hotspot in the Indian Ocean, and you can just trace the chronology works perfectly. You go back here 66 million years ago. And there are a number of other sites like this, the Siberian Traps, the Karoo, the Paraná basalts related to the Tristan hotspot, the Caribbean Plateau related to the Galapagos, et cetera. And so this became known as the plume head and tail theory for flood basalts. And these events are very large. When I say very large, the largest is 50 million cubic kilometers within a few million years at on-time Java Plateau. That's this guy over here. Deccan was only about 1 million cubic kilometers. Siberia is about 3 million cubic kilometers. But these are colossal events. And they happen on average about every 20 million years or so in Earth history, depending on the size. But they are not periodic, they're episodic in that sense. And Clint, you may recognize this. This is actually a photograph, I think, from that very tank you were talking about. This is how these, this is how these plumes work. This is a hot boundary layer and corn syrup being heated from below with a plume feeding this kind of mushroom head-like shape. And then the stem stays connected, and as the plate passes over this, you get a huge eruption with the head of the plume, and then you get the hotspot track like Hawaii or Reunion after that. And again, I'd say this is fairly accepted theory, not without its detractors in the geophysical community, but it's probably a dominant point of view. It's a little bit like a lava lamp, although lava lamps are not quite the same, but it looks kind of the same. Now here's the problem. The last 4 mass extinctions, if we include the KPG event, this is a plot of percentage of marine mammals becoming extinct versus time going back from present to the Cambrian. The last big event was the end-Cretaceous, the KPG event that killed the dinosaurs. And then we had the event, the end-Triassic, which corresponds in time to the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, which is another flood basalt province. And then the largest mass extinction of all is the Permian, which corresponds in time exactly with, within radiometric precision to the Siberian traps. In Siberia, there was a precursory flood basalt and extinction, the end-Middle Permian, the Emishan traps as well. So the last 4 mass extinctions in Earth history correspond very closely in time with large flood basalt events. And you can imagine giant volcanic eruptions can cause environmental disruption, and we'll go into the specific causes and why Siberia may have been particularly destructive. But here's the problem. The most recent event, the end-Cretaceous, is the only one for which there's any evidence that people hang their hats on for an impact at the same time. And it is exactly at the same time, within plus or minus 1 million years. And I like to think of this as kind of the ultimate conjuring of the uniformitarian versus catastrophe point of view enunciated by Charles Lyell long ago. What does this mean? I mean, maybe flood basalts are kind of a uniformitarian concept. Every once in a while they come along and kill a lot of stuff. But this is the Chicxulub impact is the largest impact in the last 1 billion years. It's the only one that we know of that is clearly correlated with a mass extinction. And that's the motivation for the work that I'm about to describe to you. Ultimately, how does this happen? And I'm going to tell you, I can't answer that question with any definitive answer, but I'm going to take you on an adventure to tell you why this is so much fun and to give you an idea maybe of why it's so important in Earth history. So this story starts with my family. Actually, we took a vacation together to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and we visited the great Mayan city of Chichen Itza inland from the coast with these fantastic pyramids and these wonderful sinkholes called cenotes in the limestones. And I recalled having seen an image. This is the northern coast of Yucatan here. And this is an image, the green and blue are the gravity anomaly associated with the Chicxulub impact, which is about 200 kilometers across here with this ring-like pattern. And the cenotes are denoted by these white symbols, and they're largely excluded from the center of the impact. To this day, I don't really know quite why that is. Chichen Itza is over here. The cenotes are the main water supply for why the Mayans were able to establish these cities and so forth. And literally after we visited Chichen Itza, I went to bed that night thinking about Chicxulub, Yucatan, Deccan Traps, KPG, and because I'm a geologist, I can't help that. And I started thinking about something I had talked about with a former student of mine named Leif Karlstrom, who's an expert on volcanism, who had pointed out to me on a trip in the Grand Canyon that we did in 2011 that there is a very clear relationship between the triggering of volcanoes and the size of earthquakes. And this plot shows moment magnitude on this horizontal axis and distance of triggering of volcanoes on this axis. And you'll just notice, to make a long story short, when you get up toward magnitude 9, you can trigger earthquakes up to about 1,000 kilometers away. For example, with the great 1960 Chilean earthquake, there were volcanoes triggered up and down the Andes and so forth. And then I started to think about Chicxulub. And because the Deccan Traps were well underway in their eruptions before the impact. The impact did not cause the magmatism that led to the volcanism, though many people had suggested that in the past. But I asked myself, well, how big was Chicxulub? How big an earthquake was that? And could that have affected the Deccan Traps in ways that haven't been recognized? And I'll skip that. To make a long story short, if you look at work by Day and Maslin and others looking at liquefaction events and slope collapse events around the Atlantic margin in response to Chicxulub, the estimate for the size of that earthquake is somewhere between 11 and 11.5. If you can imagine, 2 moment magnitude scales larger than the largest historic recorded earthquakes. And what that means is that you effectively trigger earthquakes all over the planet. Any incipient magmatic system on the planet could have been triggered by that impact. And so I went to bed literally that evening. I looked all this stuff while my family was sleeping. I was looking on my computer in Mexico, and I looked that stuff up, and I asked a simple question. Could we see the effect of the Chicxulub impact within the Deccan Traps eruptions? It's a fairly simple question. It turns out it's hard to answer. So I naturally took this question back to Walter Alvarez, and we started looking at the stratigraphic pile of the Deccan Traps, which is here. This is from bottom to top. It's about 2.5 kilometers thickness in composite section in western India, the Western Ghats. And the main subgroups are Calsubai, Lonavala, and Y. And we will be focusing on the contrast between the bushy and the polyp pore formations in a minute. But this is what the stack looked like. And the question is, where in this stack was the Chicxulub impact time-wise? And nobody knew the answer to that question within 1 million years at the time that we started thinking about this. So Walter and I started looking at the literature. We did this all from an armchair, literally in his office, in my office at Berkeley. No field work here. And we noticed something, that the earlier eruptions in Deccan, that is, things that came before the Y subgroup of eruptions, were fairly restricted in their geographical distribution. This is the Thakurvadi Formation, for example, close to Mumbai, which we'll see in photos. And then kind of the main event seems to come later with the Amanali and Polypore formations in the Y subgroup above that covered enormous, vast parts of India. And this stuck out to us as, oh, okay, well, that hasn't really been harped upon too much in the literature. This is an image from Google Earth. You can do this yourself. That shows the top of where the polypore formation is truncating the bushy formation. It's very obvious in the physiography of Western India. Walter noticed immediately that there were faults that seemed to penetrate, at least in Google Maps. The lower formation, which is the bushy, that is the B here, and that did not seem to continue through the polypore formation, indicating that something had changed at that boundary as well. And so that we immediately said, is there something going on here? Did something fundamentally change with Deccan volcanism between what it really looked like the lower polypore formation and the top of the bushy formation? And these are geochemically defined lava sequences that are mainly defined in the Western Ghats region of India, and there's controversy about how that extends elsewhere. Well, it turns out that, to make a long story short, these are Cretaceous forams and tertiary forams here that are truncated by the Amanali flows 1,000 kilometers away from the source of these lavas off in the Bay of Bengal in eastern India. And the Amanali flows, which missing the polypore flows beneath them, seem to truncate those forams offshore. That was a major hint as well. But an even bigger hint came from work by geochemist Sally Gibson and petrologist, geochemist Loic van der Kloisen, who had worked with John Mahoney extensively in Deccan. And they pointed out two things. First of all, this is kind of a map. I'm going to take some time with this because it has a huge amount of information. So these are the classical geochemically defined lava flow sequences in the Deccan Traps. Again, here's the Bushy and the Pollid Pore. And these are the pre-existing radiometric potassium-argon, argon-argon ages of these formations, which were just terrible. You can't tell within several million years of what the age of these formations were from these old radiometric ages. But for example, we know that everything from the Jawar to the top of the Mahabaleshwar were all within Cron 29R in the geomagnetic timescale, and that the width of that Cron is here in gray. So you can tell that these ages that existed at the time were virtually useless, so we couldn't correlate the different formations with the actual position in time of the KPG boundary. But what we did see was this. First of all, the dike formations feeding these flows changed in their character remarkably from the lower section to the upper section. They were largely aligned with regional tectonic stresses, as indicated here for these lower formations, and they became essentially radial and unaligned when you get into the Pollid Pore and the Ambanali and the Mahabaleshwar formations, which it turns out accounts for most of the volume of the Deccan Traps, which we didn't quite realize at that time. The other thing is that those of you who like isotopes, the epsilon neodymium values seen in these formations are only consistently positive when you get into these upper formations, which means little crustal contamination. These upper lava flows were coming through the crust with very little interaction, whereas the lower lava flows were sticking around long enough to have lots of interaction. So the whole character of Deccan volcanism seems to have changed about right here. And by about right here, I mean the boundary between the Bushy and the Pollid Formation. So Walter and I wrote a paper with a bunch of other smart people, and we predicted, without any new ages, that we thought the KPG boundary would be found near the Bushy Pollid Formation boundary. And that was a real speculation. We had nothing but I would call circumstantial evidence to suggest that there had been a transition in Deccan volcanism excited by this magnitude 11 plus earthquake. So we thought that was kind of cool. And we decided, well, heck, we're both tenured professors. We're going to go ahead and publish this anyway and let people throw darts at it all they want. And believe me, they did. But the hypothesis effectively is that a huge impact over here across the world sends very strong seismic waves. I say strong, we're talking about long period waves with tens of meters of amplitude, exciting the permeability of the system and causing much more rapid mantle-derived magmatism, if you will. And so the question is, could this possibly be true? Well, there's a simple answer, which is go out and date the rocks. And we got NSF to support us to do that, mainly through Paul Reddy's laboratory, Berkeley Geochronology Center at Berkeley. This is me, this is Paul's student, Courtney Sprain, and volcanologist Steve Self. With the Deccan Traps behind us, we spent 3 brief field seasons there. It was a great time. My first exposure to the Deccan Traps was actually on an island called Elephanta Island in Mumbai Harbor. How many people have been to Elephanta Island? There are these lovely medieval Hindu temples carved right into the Deccan Traps. Here's Steve looking at a lava flow top in one of these temples. Here's a lava flow top going right through Vishnu's mouth in this temple. But this is what the Western Ghats looks like. These are immense flows. Single flows, we think, flowed as much as 1,000 kilometers away from their source. So nothing like we've experienced certainly in human history in terms of the scale of these eruptions. This is that so-called fault that Walter had spotted from Google Maps. It turns out the fault doesn't actually truncate at the Bushy Pollid Pore boundary, which is about right here, but instead the Pollid Pore, because it's an immense flow with the flow characteristics were such that this fracture basically just didn't show up as an erosional feature. So we were wrong about that one, other than the fact that the character did change. This is Courtney with another student of mine, Tushar Mittal and Raymond Swami at the University of Pune. This area is known as Tile Bila, because that is a local language term for two horns, which these two prongs, which is this formation behind us. But this is Paul Rennie swinging his rock hammer and collecting samples, which we bagged up 600 pounds of rocks. And Kanchan Pandey of the Indian Institute of Technology in Mumbai helped us get through customs with 600 pounds of rocks to date. Now, before I show you those ages, I'm doing okay on time. I'm going to make sure I have time for the second part of my talk here. But I want to remind you of what the existing radiometric age data looked like for the Deccan Traps. Again, this is the whole stack. This is the bushy polyp pore boundary where we speculated we would find the impact. But the existing dates were all over the place. And they clearly did not, everything between here and down here in Jawar needed to fall within the 29R geochron, but clearly these ages are all over the map. And what I'm about to show you are the new ages, but the left and the right boundaries are going to be these red dashed lines, just to give you an idea of what is possible now with argon-argon geochronology. So here are the new ages. Nearly all of these are within 29R, between 65.5 and 66.5 million years. Here are also representations of the relative volumes of these formations. In the stratigraphic plot, thicknesses are all shown as the same, but in the field, in adding up the volumes, there's a massive change in the size of individual geochemically identified lava flows. So when you cross the boundary between bushy and polyp pore, you go into a completely different kind of volcanological regime. So the polyp pore, Amanali, and Mahabaleshwar flows account for probably 75% of the volume of the Western Ghats of the Deccan Traps. And these are the ages that Paul derived, we published in 2015 initially. And this is the KPG boundary at 66.04 million years right here. And if you have a little bit of imagination, you can see that within about plus or minus 30 to 50,000 years, which is radiometric precision, the bushy polyp pore boundary, or the lower polyp pore more technically, falls pretty much exactly where these ages cross the KPG boundary. Now, I want to tell you all that, we all speculate, we have ideas in science, most of them are wrong or need modification. It's pretty rare when you make a prediction like this and you go out and test it and you find a result like this. So we're pretty happy with that, as you can imagine. If you go a step further and kind of draw lines through these data above and below this magical boundary here, you find that the rate of lava flow per time increases by about a factor of 2. At first we thought it was a factor of 3. It's about a factor of 2 increase. But the character, the geochemical character, the emplacement character, the overall character of the lava flows changes fundamentally. Guess what? Right exactly at the time of the magnitude 11 earthquake generated by the Chicxulub impact. So we thought that was pretty cool. These are the new ages that we've gotten since then. There are some uranium-lead dates I'm not going to talk about here, but effectively we still have the same result that the lower polyp pore to the top of the bushy formation is the KT boundary in the Deccan Traps, and that is exactly where the very character of the flows changes. And you might imagine, okay, so if the impact caused a change in the character of Deccan Traps eruptions, and 3/4 of the volume followed, then you might imagine that maybe the impact may have influenced the eruptions and contributed to the mass extinction. And I will tell you right now, I haven't advanced far beyond that vague statement. We will in time. I want to point out something else that some of you may be familiar with, though. Just look at the left-hand side of this plot. This is age here. This is Cron 29R. This is the KPG boundary right here at 66.052 in this version. And this is global temperature inferred from oxygen isotopes. And you notice that the main excursion that you might associate with the Deccan Traps eruptions going on in 29R is clearly precursory, a global warming event that you might attribute to CO2 outgassing, and that it's basically over by the time you get to the boundary, which is to say that CO2 outgassing from the Deccan Traps almost certainly did not cause a mass extinction. There are reasons why you expect the CO2 pulse from a flood basalt eruption to be precursory to the main flows. I won't go into the physics of that right now. There's another problem, which is that these are the Western Ghats of India where we did all these measurements. These are outlying regions, the Malwa Plateau, the Saurashtra Plateau, and also this huge area offshore, which is largely unknown, which are also involved in the Deccan eruptions offshore of Western India. So there's a lot of questions. We don't have any dates from any of those places right now, so there's a lot of question marks over this. But still, this is a pretty spectacular result, which we were pretty happy. And so what do you learn from this? Well, I'd say that the hypothesis has become a theory. Chicxulub impact may have triggered the most voluminous eruptions of the Deccan Traps, which is, as a geophysicist, that's interesting. The sudden microfaunal extinction and delayed biotic recovery at KPG time may reflect the combined effects of the impact and triggered volcanism. We don't know the answer to that. My own personal opinion is that the main agent of mass extinction was the impact, but that certainly Deccan eruptions following that impact may have contributed to it, what paleontologists describe as a delayed response to, of recovery, biological recovery. So we really don't know whether T-Rex and his friends were exterminated by the impact alone. You might be disappointed in that conclusion. There's some supporting evidence for this. It hasn't been as voluminous as I'd like. Leif Karlstrom did a study with Joe Burns in 2018 suggesting that there is an anomalous pulse of seafloor topography, in other words, mid-ocean ridge volcanism corresponding to KBG time. There are signals in lithium, osmium, and carbon isotopes that may also relate to a pulse and acceleration of isotopic signature changes right at 66 million years after the Deccan Traps had already erupted. And then I'll make another speculation, which a magnitude 11 earthquake could have generated all sorts of other interesting things, such as, for example, tsunamis or seiches, which is like what happens to in a bathtub when you have an earthquake or a swimming pool. And so you might say, well, what the heck is a seiche? So that gives rise to the second part of this fable. In the early 2010s, a discovery was made in southwestern North Dakota in the Hell Creek Formation at an area called Tanis. It was made by a remarkable young paleontologist named Robert De Palma, who's here with Melanie During from Netherlands. And this is a dead fish, a fossil that they're looking at out at this formation. Robert is an interesting person. He has the Indiana Jones hat on, as you can see. And he actually named this site after the Indiana Jones movie. Tanis is the site where Indiana Jones, in the original movie, was digging up using the sunlight shining through this crystal on a rod to point out where to dig for the Lost Ark. And so Robert decided, as you'll see, for reasons you'll see in a minute, that maybe Tanis was a good name, that this site might have been kind of the Lost Ark in terms of what happened at the KPG boundary. And it's related to the size of the earthquake, which is how it relates to this talk. So this is the site. It's up here in southwestern North Dakota in Hell Creek Formation again. This is all the western interior seaway at the time, Cretaceous time, kind of speculative. And what that formation consisted of was the Hell Creek bedrock, so to speak, where you find dinosaurs. This is on a river. This is a fluvial deposit with a big sandbar, a large river, probably the size of the Missouri River in the U.S., maybe this bigger than the Danube here. I don't know how that compares. Water used to be here, and this little formation, number one, is innocuously called the event deposit. This is a cross-section and a photographic cross-section, and we're going to look at what is in this event deposit. This is one of the most remarkable geological formations, I think, discovered in recent times. The deposit consists of two layers that look like tsunami deposits. Now, again, this is in southwestern North Dakota, 3,000 kilometers away from the Chicxulub impact site, but along the western interior seaway. And you start off with coarse rocks and fining upwards and silt, and then you get another pulse, you get more coarse sediments, a thicker sediment section fining upward. And we have here, I think the total thickness here is around 1.5 meters. It varies from place to place, and it was placed on top of this river sandbar. So this is some kind of wave coming up a very large river, a lot with probably near the estuary on the Western Interior Seaway. Within that formation are continental fossils, paddlefish, sturgeons, plants, etc., of terrestrial origin, and also marine fossils, ammonite fossils, microfossils, dinoflagellates, etc. And on top of that is the iridium anomaly, and on top of that is the typical, what they call Tonstein deposit of airfall from the impact site. So we know exactly when this happened in time. This formation was exactly precursory to the Chicxulub impact infall from outer space. Now, here's something else cool. These little white dots, those are impact spherules that are embedded not only within these sedimentary layers, but also within some of the creatures, as I'll show you in a minute. So what you're looking at is about 1.5 meter section. That is, there are lots of tsunami deposits around the world, slope collapse deposits, and so forth from the impact. But this is the only one I know that is almost like a time-lapse photography of what had to have been the last hour or so of the Cretaceous. Or, depending on which paleontologist you talk to, maybe the first hour of the Tertiary, or the Paleogene. But we know these impact spherules of 3 to 5 millimeter size do not stay aloft in space and an atmosphere for more than probably 1.5 hours or 2 hours. So this is the very first hour or two of after the impact that is recorded just with spectacular precision. For example, at the top of the first layer, you see multiple crater impacts, mini craters from impact spherules falling into the mud. So this is a spherule at the bottom of this crater structure here. How that forms is another story I won't go into, but you know what's going on and when it's going on here. These are dinosaur footprints at the top of the sandbar immediately beneath the first sedimentary layer. We know the dinosaurs were alive at that time, and they were crawling all over the place at this particular site. These are X-ray images of the head of a sturgeon. This is a close-up here, and these are CT scans of that same area, and these little green dots are impact spherules. This fish was swimming along in this river trying to survive while ingesting impact spherules falling through the water column that was eventually swept in here and died. And you can actually tell the direction of the waves going in and out these two pulses because the fish heads are aligned, as you would expect, aerodynamically, so to speak, with the streamlines of the flow. So back to this image. This is not just some innocent KPG boundary formation. This is a spectacular discovery, and we've only begun to really unravel what all it means. But I'll give you a little sense of this and why this is so interesting to me and what an adventure it's been. I would say that you can look at the Tanis deposit from a geophysical standpoint as kind of a paleoseismometer. How did you get a 10-meter wave at 3,000 kilometers distance up a large river on an arm of the Western Interior Seaway? Well, that might be a lot harder than you think. Let me tell you why. The impact is 3,000 kilometers away from the Tanis site. You cannot possibly propagate a tsunami in less than 10 to 20 hours to this site, just by water wave speeds. So this was not a tsunami from the impact site, but this was clearly a water wave that is associated and, clearly associated with the impact. What happened? Well, I got involved with this because Jan Schmidt and I were sitting in a crummy bar in Nagpur, India, when we were taking samples for argon dating, and Jan said, "Mark, I got this problem. I'm working with this kind of strange paleontologist who is working in southwestern North Dakota, and he thinks there was a tsunami from the impact in North Dakota, but I don't think that works. I don't know how you get a tsunami up there. I don't know if the Western Interior Seaway was deep enough or continuous enough to propagate a tsunami." And I immediately said, "Well, it's not a tsunami, Jan. You can't get it there in time." So I went again, I had one of those nights where I went back to my hotel room and started looking at the literature. I'm that kind of a nerd. And one of the first things I found was that the Tohoku earthquake of 2011, which is a magnitude 9.2, excited seiches in Norwegian fjords of order 1 to 1.5 meters amplitude. And I quickly did the calculation. I said, okay, magnitude 9.2, 1.5 meters, magnitude 11, you could have factor of 30 up to maybe 30 meters amplitude. So I said, okay, we can have effectively local seismic excitation of waterways in the Western Interior Seaway from the arrival of seismic waves, which get there in 9 to 13 minutes, depending on whether it's P waves or S waves. And then those waves propagate up the river. And so this made it quite a story. People got excited about this. There was the most read article in the New Yorker magazine in the year 2019 was this April 2019 article called "The Day the Dinosaurs Died," with Robert De Palma here featured on the cover. It really should be called "The Hour the Dinosaurs Died," because this deposit literally is telling you that. And we started to work on it. Turns out that there is one of the world's foremost tsunami modelers, happened to be a professor at the University of Washington in applied mathematics, named Randy Levesque. He came to my talk on this and said, "Mark, I think you're wrong. It's hard to get a tsunami to do that." So we went to work together. We involved Satish Maura, who is a seismologist who does calculations of far-field normal mode propagation of seismic waves. He's a postdoc with Barbara Romanovich at Berkeley. And Satish did these calculations kind of reproducing what other people had done, calculating the seismic disturbance from Chicxulub. And I just want to point out this is radial displacement, radial velocity, radial acceleration as a function of time, hundreds of seconds after the impact. And I just want to point out that the radial displacement is 20 meters at 3,000 kilometers distance, which just tells you that we're out of the realm of normal human experience when it comes to trying to figure out what an event like this could cause to happen. So Satish and I worked with Randy Levesque and a number of others, and we have a paper that's just about to come out on this. But Randy pointed out that there's a big problem here, and we're still scratching our heads over this. This is a kind of a schematic of what happens when you have a wave generated out in a body of water due to seismic excitation, which arrives in time. You can do that within 10 minutes or so of the impact. And you have a pulse propagating toward the shoreline, and it drags with it, if you will, it displaces a water column whose cross-sectional area is about equal to the cross-sectional area of the wave. As that pulse approaches the shoreline, it's trying to mix salt water in pink with fresh water in blue as it goes up the river estuary. But here's the problem, and Randy pointed this out immediately, that the width of mixing between salt water and fresh water is dependent upon the pulse width, which is dependent upon the source duration of the impulse. Now, for these seismograms, the source duration used was what impact people told us to use, which is about 60 seconds. I'll get back to that question in a minute. But with only a relatively brief source duration, it turns out that you can't get mixing of salt water and fresh water more than about half a kilometer to a kilometer up a riverbed. And I'm not going to describe this because I have limited time, but this just illustrates how hard that is to do with actual nonlinear wave equation interaction calculations, the kind of stuff that Randy Levesque does. But why is that a problem? Anybody tell me why is that a problem? Why is the problem of saltwater mixing upriver a problem at all? Because we have marine fossils at the Tanis site, and we don't think that site is within less than 5 or 10 kilometers of the estuary itself. So I don't know how those ammonite fossils get up the river. And it doesn't matter whether the excitation is seiche-like, if you will, of seismic waves exciting the Western Interior Seaway, or if there's a local landslide induced by the impact, or even local co-seismic motion on a fault, of which there were not many active at the time in that region. It is really hard to explain that aspect of the sedimentology. Now, of course, the way you do that is simple. First of all, you make the wave a little bigger. That's okay. These amplitudes that we calculated typically were of order meters. flowing upriver. We need 10 meters. Okay, make it an 11.5 instead of an 11 earthquake. But the other way to fix this in terms of the mixing length is the source process time. That when people talk about a 60 or 100-second source process time for the Chicxulub impact from crater modeling, they're talking about the explosion, if you will. They're not talking about the crater rebound time, which, even though it's much less energetic, is much more strongly seismically coupled. The seismic coupling of an explosion is 1 part in 100 or 1,000. The seismic coupling of the rebound of the crater would be almost perfect. And so it could be much less energetic, but generate motions that are much longer period. What do I mean by longer period? Well, what we really think is that these two pulses arriving at Tanis were probably separated by tens of minutes. Now, if you look at the Sendai Plain from the Tohoku earthquake in Japan back to that earthquake, this is flooding of the coast that occurred due to that earthquake. This is a 100-kilometer broad fault, and the period of excitation of the displacement of the ocean floor leading to this tsunami wave is of order 30 minutes or so. And these saltwater waves penetrated up rivers and into the coastal areas by 5 to 10 kilometers, which is what we actually need for Chicxulub. So I'm not answering a lot of questions here, but I'm posing them, and I'm hoping that you will be satisfied with that. The challenges here, first of all, this really can't be a classical resonance SAIS because it would take too long for that to develop anyway. It would take probably several hours to get enough resonance going. But a pulse from seismic excitation of the Western Interior Seaway would work. But it may also suggest that the actual event in Yucatan, in terms as a seismic event, especially as a long period seismic event, had more to do with the crater dynamics following the initial impact than it did with the impact itself. So I can easily get a relaxation time of tens of minutes of the crater after the initial explosion, if you will. So it may be that that source process time is the answer. But there are other mechanisms available. Like I said, there's a possibility. There are slope collapse events that you see along the Western Interior Seaway in the late Cretaceous. You certainly have triggered those, although the amplitudes are a little tricky to get up to 10 meters water wave. But there is also there's another mechanism that I'll get to in a second. Another point I would make is that whatever happened at Tanis could have happened practically everywhere in the world. Tanis is 3,000 kilometers away from Chicxulub, and it's going to cause people to go back and take another look at what have been called KPG tsunami deposits. For example, there's a famous deposit in Croatia, Hvar, Croatia, that seems to have been shielded by islands at the time, and it may have been a phenomenon more like this than a direct tsunami propagating up the proto-Mediterranean Sea and so forth. So it opens up all sorts of questions about how we interpret these KPG deposits worldwide. There's another alternative, which is the atmospheric effects from the impact itself. The direct blast wave, if you will, is subsonic in the far field, which means it can't get there in time. The Hunga Tonga, those of you who are familiar with this recent discovery of these lamb waves excited by the Hunga Tonga eruptions, similarly are limited by the atmospheric wave propagation speed, which is 300 meters per second, which is far too slow to explain the infall of the impact ejecta with the impact at the site, at the Tanis site. But there's one more mechanism that we're still scratching our heads over, which is that the expanding ejecta curtain itself, that is, these ejecta are being blasted out into space into ballistic trajectory, and then they're falling back to Earth as kind of a curtain, if you will, and expanding in time. And of course, that is happening when the ejecta are coming down. So that's a possible excitation mechanism for water waves. The people who do this, the foremost architects of these types of calculations are Natasha Artemieva and Joanna Morgan, who published this paper in 2020. Here's an illustration at 300 seconds, 600 seconds, et cetera, of this expanding ejecta curtain, which basically, you see the vertical scale here is 450 kilometers. So all this stuff is happening in outer space. It's blasting this curtain out, and then the infall comes in, and you can imagine that can cause an atmospheric disturbance and pressure wave. But the calculations don't suggest that there's enough energy in that pressure wave to excite large water waves. To be determined, something that we're working on. So I'm going to end more or less on time and leave some time for questions. What's next here is further seismic excitation modeling. We need to go back and work with people like Mark Boslow and others who calculate crater dynamics, they use the same codes they use to model H-bombs at the national laboratories. I think we've opened up a new constraint on that cratering and crater rebound process here potentially that might help us explain what we observe at Tanis. And isn't that lovely that you're thinking about constraining the cratering process by looking at marine fossils transported up an ancient river? That's geology. We need to have a better understanding of the atmospheric effects. Like I said, the calculations by Artemiev and Morgan are kind of preliminary, and we're looking forward to working with them on that. The thing I'm most excited about, of course, is going back in the field, because that's what motivates most of us. We like to go out and look at stuff, look at rocks, and there's a lot more we can learn from the sedimentology here. The emphasis that Robert De Palma and others have placed on this work is understandably paleontological. They're finding intact, dinosaur fossils within this formation in places now. But the sedimentology has only been kind of weakly explored. For example, a simple question is, how much time is represented between those two pulses? We don't know, but if we knew that, it would be a fantastic constraint on whatever processes led to these surges that came. And as I was putting this together last night, and I had the title of this slide, What's Next, I could not help myself. The most iconic line from the recent movie Oppenheimer is when Harry Truman asks Robert Oppenheimer, what's next? And this is the expression on his face. Had to throw that in there. But it turns out in 2021, a BBC film crew got a hold of this idea. They came out to the Tanis site. This is the film crew. And this is them doing their work, literally standing on top of the of the event deposit, which is kind of crumbly, as you might imagine, at Tanis. This is where they hitch up the camera set up to Robert De Palma in his Indiana Jones hat driving out to the site, so it all gets dramatized. It's a 2-hour special with David Attenborough narrating. You can see it. The Nova version of this is called Dinosaur Apocalypse. I can't remember what the BBC version was. But it's all fun. But I wanted to show this last slide as kind of a conclusion, which is that I had the great privilege of visiting this site with both Jan Schmidt on the left and Walter Alvarez on the right in 2017. And it is a great reminder to me personally that sometimes we take ourselves very seriously in this business, and we get rather wedded to certain ideas and concepts and ideas, and we want to defend them, and we sure want to be right, and we want people to be impressed and so forth. But the relationship between Jan and Walter Alvarez has been an inspiration to me personally, which, like I said, that it could have been very acrimonious. They made what is arguably the most singular discovery in geological sciences of the last 100 years simultaneously and independently, and they ended up becoming very, very best of friends as a result of that work, and I'm proud and happy to call them both personal friends. And we got a lot to do. I hope if I've left you with no other impression here at all, that this has been a talk more about questions than about answers. That the more we look into this, the more fascinating and interesting it becomes, and we still are so far from understanding the actual mechanisms of, and I used plural on purpose, the mechanisms of mass extinction. And just so you know, I and most other people still think that the impact itself was the primary agent of mass extinction. But the relation to Deccan eruptions and the cause of extinction from previous flood basalt eruptions like the Siberian Traps, which is associated with the largest mass extinction in Earth history, we don't know much about those things yet, and we got a long way to go. So I've given this talk in several different places, and in several times, and including the talk that I gave when Randy Levesque, the tsunami modeler, happened to be attending, I've learned more from the talk than other people have because people come up to me with their ideas. So I would like to invite questions, but I'd like to also invite ideas. Well, thank you all very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mark. That was really interesting and certainly relevant, very relevant to the FAB goals. Yeah, we would like to get some questions and ideas from all of you. Just one, sorry to interrupt. We ask you to speak into the microphones.
Yeah, I just read some papers about, for example, that the Permian traps has been triggered also by a meteorite impact. How possible is that actually meteorite can actually send waves to the inside the mantle to the other side of the Earth and make kind of like pop triggering, like pressure?
That's a very, very good question. From at least 3 decades ago, beginning with work by Michael Rampino and others, there's been a suggestion that the flood basalt events are caused by impact and that they result from antipodal focusing of seismic waves. There's several things wrong with that. First of all, you'd expect by far the largest melting event to occur at the impact site and not at the antipode. Secondly, the amount of energy available to cause melting is just insufficient. The fact that the Deccan Traps may have been accelerated in their eruptions is because you give this porous system a strong shake and you change the permeability, but you're not creating new magma. There's not enough heat for that. The third thing that's wrong with that is that the Deccan Traps were not antipodal to the Chicxulub impact. They're about 130 degrees away. As for evidence, people have looked high and low for evidence associating the Permian, the Siberian traps with an impact event. I'm not aware of any of that evidence that has stuck. I'd be interested if there's new evidence you want to tell me about. Thanks. Clint? Oh, she's getting the questions. Okay, great.
Hi. This on?
Yeah.
Okay. Returning to the volcanology, so I could imagine how the waves would like open up or loosen the volcanic system and make a pulse of magma, but I don't see that lasting 500,000 years, which was the time scale on your graph. So I'm just wondering if you can explain it that long, but also maybe it looks to me like the first sequence, Podapor or something, sorry, I don't know the names there.
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand the
if the first sequence of lava might actually almost have a uniform age from the diagram you showed. That is the rate increasing by a factor of 2 on each side of the boundary. I wonder if that right after the boundary, it's not actually much, much faster, and then return to a more reasonable rate after that first sequence, which name escapes me at the moment.
Yeah, thanks. Those are questions I wrestle with myself. Let me try to give a partial answer. Leif Karlström, like I said, a former student of mine, he's also the son of Carl Karlström, and those of you who know the famous metamorphic petrologist, who I think is of Norwegian origin, probably with that name. But anyway, Leif did, in our first paper, he was a co-author on that paper in 2015, he did some calculations in the appendix. And to go back kind of the beginning of your question, a lot of several different mechanisms have been proposed for how earthquakes trigger volcanoes. But the literature is crammed full of those cases that involve, like Andean volcanoes, where you already have a magma chamber and you're exciting the magma chamber, and you may have bubble nucleation, or you may just have a local permeability increase that causes a temporary flow. In this case, given the volume of lavas we're talking about, you would have to have excitation of the partially molten mantle beneath the lithosphere. And that naturally introduces a much longer time scale for extraction of the magma. And so the way I envision this, but I can't back it up with good models yet, is that you give it a strong shake, you have immediate flow, say for the next few thousand years or whatever, that allows magma to become more concentrated at the base of the lithosphere, and it takes quite a while for that stuff to fracture its way into the lithosphere, 4 magma chambers. And so Leaf, if you look at the paper, he actually came up with a pretty broad range of time scales, but the favored time scales were of order 10,000 to 100,000 years in those calculations. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's in the paper. I didn't produce that myself. It's not unreasonable, but it's a really good question.
How do you go from a bolide impact or a volcanic flow or an earthquake to killing very large reptiles and not killing all the stuff that didn't go extinct? Which mechanism is most convincing to you?
Well, I'm not, this is where I get to say I'm not a paleontologist and I don't know much about dinosaurs. Let me back that up and say, when people talk about, for example, the correspondence of the Siberian traps with the end-Permian extinction, they're mainly talking about nowadays not CO2 production, but rather the interaction of magmas with crustal rocks that produce fluorine, chlorine, and sulfur dioxide gases, which are noxious, that do all sorts of bad things to all sorts of critters. So the tie between flood basalt volcanism and extinction is probably not CO2, and it's probably rather randomly dependent upon where the plume head happens to surface. So that's a pre-answer to your question. As for how the impact can wipe out selectively all these different craters, there's a big literature on that, and I don't know. People will argue about this a lot. For example, people talk about the immediate, this gets back to kind of part of the question of what happened in those first few hours after the eruption. For example, at Tanis, you see remains of charred vegetation, trees and so forth, caught up in this. So people talk about effectively incinerating the atmosphere at the time of this impact from the infall. So, you know, that's going to do a lot of damage. Why did that kill T-Rex and not squirrels? I don't know. Or why did it kill everything but the birds? Well, it killed most of the birds, actually. Only a few strains of clades, if you will, of birds made it through. So most of the birds actually did die. And it didn't kill the turtles and the tortoises and the crocodiles and so forth. So it was selective. I have no idea how to answer that question. But I guess I'm a little bit of an optimist, though, which I really do believe that oddly, this site in North Dakota has the potential to teach us what's going on in the far field in the first few hours after that impact. And so I don't know where this leads, but I hope it bears on that question.
Okay, Razvan.
Yeah, when you look at the CO2 level right before the impact, there was that spike, and then it goes down,
Yes.
and it doesn't come up again. So how comes that you have such a huge amount of basalt coming up, and you don't have a CO2 release in the atmosphere that you would see?
It turns out I've done a good bit of thinking about that along with two former student and two former students of mine, Tushar Mittal, who published a paper on outgassing from magma chambers, and also Cinzia Farnatani, who's now at the University of Paris and works on what happens when you have kind of geochemically heterogeneous rise of mantle plumes. In the latter case, the model suggests that when you have a plume rising in the mantle, say a plume head, the first thing that starts to melt above the wet solidus has high concentrations of CO2 and H2O. So you expect the CO2, if anything, to be in the first phases of flood volcanism. And there's some evidence for that from other provinces I won't go into right now. And so I think that that also is as the magmas begin to concentrate beneath the lithospheric plate and go into magma chambers, you're also going to tend to erupt the stuff that's CO2 rich first. So I'm not surprised by the fact that in Deccan, where we have a pretty good record, the evidence for global warming, presumably due to CO2 production, is effectively precursory to the main stage eruptions. Can't prove that, but it's not surprising to me.
Okay, are there any other questions? Maybe one more? Yeah, we have one more question.
Yeah, great stuff, thank you. How far can you trace the event deposit, and are there any variations you see along the way there?
That event deposit would almost fit into this room. It's a very small piece of territory. It's about half an acre. I don't know what an acre translates into in your units here, but it's small. And we would love to get money to go out and drill around and use electromagnetic prospecting methods to see if we can trace that event horizon. We simply haven't been able to do it. As far as we know, it's a unique site. It's a very restricted site. It would not be surprising if somebody did a lot of field work in that area and came up with some other examples of it. The thing we'd love to do, though, is if we could extend that site by even hundreds of meters, we might learn a whole lot more. Now, remember, it's a peculiar situation. It's a large sandbar in a large river where you had, run-up and deposition that didn't get subsequently eroded for the most part. So it might be hard to find, but I would say we need about $2 million of money from the National Science Foundation to go out and do that properly.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you all
We'll
very
just thank the speaker once again.